Hello, everyone. Welcome. How are you all? Thank you so much. Oh, my hair is a mess. Gosh. Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Brandon Ivy. I am the Associate Artistic Director at Village Theater and the host of most of these happy hour events. You're here at Village Theater's Happy Hour, where we have guests, artists, staff members, writers, directors, all kinds of folks. And this week we have a many multi-hyphenate guest with us. They're a former Seattleite, a writer, a Broadway actor, a musician. They're in The Great Comet on Broadway. They've been in a number of productions of Jesus Christ Superstar, including NBC's live TV version. They're also a very talented musical theater composer. Their name is Heath Saunders, and they wrote this really fascinating article or essay on medium.com that's called What I Think About When I Hear That Broadway is Racist. It came out a week or two ago, and it sort of sent the Broadway community by storm and had a lot of people reading it and talking about it. And Heath is a friend of mine, and so I thought it would be really fun for us to have a chat about it. So please welcome to the program, Heath Saunders.
Hey, so...
Hi, Heath. How are you?
Oh, just chilling in my quarantine.
Yeah, and you're in New York, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Are you still up? Are you still uptown? You
Yeah.
moved, didn't you?
I did. I moved from uptown to slightly less uptown. 30 blocks.
Oh, I mean that's a. Are you in Harlem now?
Not quite. I was at 181, and now I'm at 156-ish. So 25.
Oh, okay. You're like close to where I used to be.
Yeah. Yes, because you're at 145 in Edgecombe.
145, yeah. It is happy hour, so what are you drinking?
Mango White Claw, obviously.
Amazing. I'm drinking.
I am a frat boy.
I'm drinking Taco Time Diet Coke.
Is there rum in it?
No.
Well, not much of a happy hour.
I can't believe I've only drank once during all of quarantine.
Literally. That's very healthy.
Well, I'm realizing how much of a social drinker I am.
Yeah.
And so when I'm like alone in my apartment, I just don't. So
I had one of my like most random emotional experiences during quarantine was actually I got myself beer one because I was like at the store and I was like, I want a beer. And I got beer, and I sent my sense association with beer is so specific to sitting at bars with my friends, like having a beer, that I literally had this like bizarre emotional reaction when I tasted beer. I was like, this is very strange, because I just don't drink beer when I'm it's not like a thing that I do except for
those weird sensory things.
Yeah.
Like whenever I smell cigarette smoke, I'm like immediately sucked back to my grandma's house.
Right. It's like so intense. And I didn't realize I had that with beer, but that's what I'm like, yeah, I guess I only drink beer socially. And that was like,
well, there you go.
Huh.
So thanks for joining us. This is going to be, I'm really looking forward to this. Everyone watching, hello, this is Heath. Heath, this is everyone.
Hi, everyone.
Please, if you have questions or comments, there is a comment box that you can write in. And we will get to those if we can. Hopefully at the end of the broadcast, we can do like a big long question and answer session. Yeah. Normally these historically, I guess, these happy hours have been a little more informal and a little more sort of like bouncing back and forth, so we've been able to interact more with commenters. But this one's pretty specific about an article or an essay. I keep calling it an article.
Well, it's weird. I had a hard time deciding what to call it. Some people were like, your op-ed. And I was like, it's not really an op-ed. Like, I really just like wrote a thing and then put it out into the world. Yeah. It was going to be a Facebook post originally. And then it just got so intense that I was like, okay, I'll put it.
Yeah. Well, obviously, I mean, this is a lot of time to spend on a Facebook post. My God, it's very well structured and written and all of that.
Well, that's how it started. It was a Facebook post.
So if anyone does have comments, please write them and we'll get to them if we can. If you have questions, write those and we'll get to them at the end of the of the happy hour. So Heath, why don't you talk just a little bit about where this came from? Because I'm sure there's some people that have read the article, essay, op-ed that are here, but why don't you give us like a little background of what, because there's kind of a specific moment that prompted you talking about this.
Yeah, well, and it's funny because again, when I say it started as a Facebook post, it really did start as a Facebook post. A friend of mine had posted about the fact that there was a Playbill announcement the week of George Floyd's death that was like, hey, Hairspray in the future should only be done with Black people. And I was like, what? Like, everything about this is insane to me. Like, I just was like,
why would you ever have to say that?
Right. Well, and the funny thing is that I knew that people had done all white versions of Hairspray. I knew that had happened. Because when I had done the show, I was like, somebody had sent me, they were like, in Plano, Texas, they're doing whatever, or like in Arizona or something. And sorry, Plano with Texas and Arizona are not the same thing, and I understand that. But they were like, this is happening, and I was like, yeah, that seems crazy. And they're like, well, it's an all-white community theater, and I'm like, that's still sketchy. But and at the time, I was like, okay, this is insane. Why is this the thing? And the thing that really set me off was that, like, now in the wake of this sort of moment, because our culture just like cracked open. We've had continuous protests in New York for the last 30 days around the country. Like, this is a thing. And I was like, 2 seconds into this thing, we decided that we were going to talk about Hairspray not being racist or something. And I was like, this is so strange. And the post that spurred this down, basically, a friend of mine had posted, hey, it's so nice that Hairspray is now going to be the story of diversity and inclusion that it was meant to be. And I read that and I was like, something about this feels sketchy to me. It doesn't feel this. Everything about this is a white person posting about Hairspray now being the story of inclusion. Like, everything about it was like, there's all these layers. So I responded to the post and I was like, so you are conscious that Hairspray actually is part of a whole history of a utilization of a culture to tell a certain story across time. Like, this is a thing that has been happening over and over again. The story of integration is not necessarily the story of anti-racism. But it's basically what I posted. And they were like, sorry, what? And I was like, well, and then I started, and I literally like typed out this comment, and this comment was like, it became an essay comment. And I was like, this is not going to be clear. Cause I was angry and I was like worked up, and I was like, this is such a delicate thing that I'm talking about. I need to back up. And in the comments, sort of, the discussion carried on without me, and people were talking about stories where they had been in The Wiz, in an all-white The Wiz, or they had been in West Side Story, and they were like, I was in an all-white West Side Story and I played a shark. And there was like, it became this like white people flagellating themselves for having done something when they were youths. And I was like, this is confusing. Like, I there's something happening here that I want to, I need to, I was like, I want to pull this conversation apart. And that's sort of like, and I was like, okay, how am I going to do this? And I started by basically taking those 3 shows, The Wiz and West Side Story and Hairspray, and basically doing this is what's happening when white people are in The Wiz. This is what's happening when white people are in Hairspray. This is what's happening when white people are in West Side Story. And each of those things were profoundly different to me. And I realized when I wrote 10,000 words on the subject that I was like, I'm doing something much bigger than what this is not a Facebook response. So I started to edit it. I edited it down to like 8,500 words, and I sent it to a friend of mine who is a journalist, and they were like, okay, first off, whoa. Second off, I think you should publish this. You should put it out in the world. You should decide what it is you're trying to say, and you should put it out into the world. And I was like, cool. And that created this sort of 5-day sequence where things I would write, I would edit, and I would send it to one person, and I would basically have a 5-hour conversation with them about it. And then I would go back and I'd write, and I was like, okay, so that when I said these things, this is what they heard. And I was like, that's not what I'm trying to say. And it kept going and going and going until finally, 5 days later, out of truly working on it for 8 hours a day for 5 days, I was like, okay, I think it's ready to be put out. And I was doing the final touches on it when the We See You White Theater letter got posted.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, oh, okay. I am so pro the energy of that letter. I am so here for what we're talking about, which is like,
why don't we make like a super quick explanation of what this letter is?
A number of artists on Broadway and on television, basically people of color, BIPOC artists, came together and they drafted this letter that was like, hey, white theater, these are the ways you have abused us over the years. We are now bonding together to talk about that. And I was like, this is very exciting because it's good. We want these people to talk about it. But I got in this state where I was like, okay, first off, we haven't finished this conversation about Black people. So I'm here for this expanded conversation, but I want to make sure that use of this expanded conversation is not taking away from the real conversation about the actual Black death in our country right now. So that was sort of my primary thing. And then the second thing was I wanted to make sure that we were really, at least in my communities, the people who I was talking to about it, that we were really, really particular with the language we use to talk about how Broadway is racist. And that's became the essay, what I think about when I hear that Broadway is racist. So I basically do this. The essay is at core a retrospective look at stories in musical theater, analyzing the way that they use Black bodies on stage in their storytelling. And that's what the essay is about. Which is not actually. Can you tell that I've had to explain to people what the
talk about it? You did that's far better than I would have been able to like condense it into like one idea.
But again, this is I've done this before now. This is like this is not the first time I've, because again, like you said, when people started sharing it and listening and talking about it, I found myself in this position where people were really like, what are you saying? Right. And that's sort of what I then have been like, I'm really happy to have conversations with people to like, I want to talk about what it is, because the essay is not meant to be a prescription. I am not saying here's a problem and here's how to solve it. Although I do, in my being a writery flourish about it, structure it like it has a beginning and a middle and an end, and it feels like a thing. But it is not a solution that I offer. It is simply a new way of looking at what we've been talking about, and that's sort of what my goal with it is.
Yeah, one of the things that you mentioned that in the purposes of this essay, you talk about anti-Blackness as specifically, what do you say? You say like the disenfranchisement of
the literal Black
bodies, like literal Black bodies, not Black culture but is literally about Black bodies on stage, and the how would you say it? The lack of.
Well, it's sort of the tropes. It's the way that we use. There's a story associated with a body, right? When you put a Black person on stage, we, the audience, and this is huge, right? But essentially, one of the challenges with making a show, with making theater, with making a movie, with making television, with telling a story, is that you actually have an implied audience to your story. When you think about who you're talking to, you're actually talking to someone. And one of the things that I think we fail to recognize a lot of times in these conversations is that the neutral audience for a Broadway show is a wealthy white person. That is, and that has everything to do with like, that's not just the demographics of people who, it's not like Black people don't like Broadway. It's literally the people who are paying for the thing or look like a very specific thing. So you are talking to a very specific demographic when you write a show. So the story that we tell ourselves about musical theater, where we're saying, it's a universal story. That's not actually true, because if it were true, then every show would be for everyone, and that's simply not how shows work. So one of the things that ends up happening is that you find yourself in this position where when you put a black body on stage and a wealthy white person is looking at it, what is the story that tells? That's the question at the center here, which is like, because people see color. Then when you put a black body, it's not like people are like, I didn't know that person was black. Like that is just simply not what's going on. You put a black body on stage and that person is black. So the question is, what is the story that you're telling by putting that black body in that position on the stage? And are you confronting the audience's understanding of that body in a specific and targeted way? And the answer is usually no, because we don't think about this. This is not a way that we like think about how we tell stories. Mm-hmm. But this conversation is the thing that I think is so important, because if we're not pushing against the story that people are telling themselves about those bodies, then we are in fact just reaffirming the story that people are telling about those bodies.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so many of those stories, and you very aptly pointed it out, are attempting to like see beyond race and to actually make race not a factor.
Yeah.
And to just sort of ignore it. And that's like, oh, everything will be perfect when there is no difference between everyone. And why are you paying attention to it in the first?
Well, it's challenging because, of course, you know, when we talk about musical theater has some limits of the medium, right? When people want to feel, it's funny, I say feel good when they leave a musical, and I don't really mean feel good, because you can like leave a musical devastated, and musicals can be tragic and like so on and so forth. But like, the end of basically every musical is a lift of some sort, where we're like, we did the thing. And the challenge is that when you explicitly make your show about race relations, the lift at the end of it is almost always going to be, we did it. you know how to fix racism, and that's what we're talking about here, right? And that's sort of a challenge. I think that what I find really interesting is that what I don't talk about in the essay is plays. That there's actually a lot of plays that explicitly deal with this very specific question. I think Fairview is specifically about the way that a black body is on stage. In Fairview by Jackie Sibley's Jury, the show actually interrogates the audience's understanding of the black body. In Slave Play by Jeremy O. Harris on Broadway interrogates the way that the audience sees the black body on stage. But that's not something that really happens in musicals. The closest to it happening in musicals is Hamilton. But Hamilton spends so much of the show basically being like, their bodies aren't the point, that you end up in this space where it's like, so are you saying again not to see the bodies that are on stage?
Yeah. So let's get to like some specific examples.
Yeah.
You talk in the essay a lot about how blackness in musical theater exists in like imagined worlds, like real worlds.
Yeah.
And something that I think is interesting is that when I read it and I heard imagined worlds, I thought of only things like The Wiz that are literally like fantasies. You also bring in issues where like the race of that character is inconsequential,
right?
Even if they are, even if it's like traditionally played by a black person, it is still not a part of the story or any consequence. So can you talk a little bit about like the shows that you consider like the imagined world, the shows you consider the real world?
Yeah. So one of the things that I spend a lot of real estate in the essay doing, less than I actually originally did, because I used to, like you said, I'm a multi-hyphenate. So I'm an actor and I'm a writer and I'm a musician and I'm a music director and a director. And I do all of these different things. So I find myself in different positions with different roles. And one of the things that this essay is really specifically about is not actors. Because actors, the story of individual actors' experiences inside of shows tends to basically take over the conversation about what that show is doing. And that's largely because of the nature of actors as labor. Like, actors want to work, so the actor is going to be willing to justify things that are happening. And this makes it sound like I'm like actors don't care. And it's not that. It's that when I'm an actor, I have done things as an actor that I can look at and be like, Heath, that's a weird way to use your body on stage. Like your body being on stage in that context
Yeah,
is
yeah.
problematic.
Mhm.
And when I'm an actor, because I make my living doing that, I have to sort of navigate this conversation internally. It's not a thing that I do externally, because you don't want, as an actor, you don't want to be seen as difficult, or you don't want to be seen. There's all these challenges with the relationship between the actor and the creative team that makes it so this is not a neutral, it's not an even playing field, right? And that's a real challenge. So one of the things that I spend a lot of my time doing, one of the things that I consider my privilege, is like when I step into my writer role, when I talk to actors about their experiences, it's really good to like be able to talk about what it is the actor's experiencing and what that person is experiencing in that body. The authenticity argument, right? You want to use actors who are authentically the thing that they say they are in the show. But the challenge is that that's actually not really how acting works. And I say this as a person who is a Black person who never plays Black on stage, with very few exceptions, because people do not see my body as Black. And because people don't see my body on stage as Black, that means that functionally I am not Black on stage. So that challenge, that conflict in me is what sort of bore this out, which is like where I'm like, hey, we really have to pull away from a conversation about authentic performers and instead talk explicitly about the way that the body is used in that context. So that was a long preamble. And to answer your actual specific question, I talk about there being two ways to use a body on stage. One is an imagined world and one is a real world. The imagined world is a world in which a body, a character with a Black body, is not seen in their Blackness and does not see Blackness. So while this makes sense in a fantasy world like The Wiz, which is this is a show in which the Blackness of the body is sort of incidental to the story of the show. Yes, the show borrows heavily from African American culture, and therefore it makes more sense to see Black bodies in those roles. But their Blackness is actually not the thing that the story is about. So that becomes an imagined world.
Mhm.
The challenge is that there's also another version of an imagined world, which is that, and this is to me what colorblind casting is. So what happens a lot is a character will be played by an actor who is a person of color, and that actor will bring their experience of being a person of color, and therefore they embody the show with that experience. But the show, that experience is irrelevant to the story of the show. So my sort of favorite example of this is actually Rent, because people think about Rent as being a very multicultural show because the original cast was in fact quite there was a lot of different colors on stage, or a lot of different people, different bodies. But in actuality, none of the characters really talk about that or see it beyond the fact that things happen, like Tom Collins sings a gospel number, which codes to the audience as a Black person singing a Black person thing. But what's actually happening, again, the story is not about that Blackness. The Blackness is essentially irrelevant to that story. And so I characterize that use of a body as an imagined world, because in that world, the characters are not seen in their Blackness and they do not see Blackness. On the other side of the coin is this sort of notion of a real world. And the real world is a world in which a character does see their Blackness, because turns out in the real world, we see each other's Blackness and we see our own Blackness. So a story in which characters see other characters' Blackness and see their own Blackness are stories about a real world. The challenge is that in stories about a real world, we always end up telling the same story about the way that people relate to Blackness. So even a show that is ostensibly extremely powerful, like Dreamgirls, which is again a show that I love, Dreamgirls uses Blackness in the show in the way that an audience understands Blackness to relate to people. So Blackness in terms of whiteness means that the Blacker body experiences more struggle, experiences more challenges associated with the self because of their neutral Blackness. Dreamgirls doesn't do anything to confront that notion. It simply sort of plays into it. And Dreamgirls is actually interesting. I don't talk about this in the article at all, but Dreamgirls does a pretty cool thing. Dreamgirls, by having the story be explicitly about Effie's weight, that Effie is, in fact, that the discrimination in Dreamgirls actually isn't really born of blackness. It's actually born of what somebody looks like. Dina is the pretty one versus Effie being the talented, less pretty one. That becomes this sort of real interesting pivot, which makes it actually relatable. It makes it universally relatable in a way that's sort of remarkable. Technically, you should not do this. Technically, you could do Dreamgirls with all white people, and the story of Dreamgirls would in fact still be the same thing, because the only time they reference their blackness is specifically in the moment in Cadillac Car where white people steal from the black people. And what's funny is that in the context of the show, it happens in the expositional context part of the show, right? It is used as a reason why characters who we don't like Curtis, does things. It's used as basically his villain song. Yeah. He is a villain because white people are cruel, which is a really, really like interesting choice, right? It's a funny thing to do because the implications it has about what it means to be black in the world. Now, what sort of ends up being really odd about this is that, like, when you look at, and I don't do this until the very end of the show, or of the essay, sorry. We're gonna call my essay a show now. Yeah. But I don't really do this till the end of the essay, where I actually talk about the bodies of the writers of the shows and the creators and the directors, and all of the people involved in the creation of these shows are all almost entirely white people. And white people think about race in this sort of specific way. And you find out how white people think about race by the way that they use these bodies on stage. Because this is not the story that black creators are telling about black bodies. This is the story that white people are telling about black bodies. And that's where I go, when we talk about the experience of the actor as being the dominating thing, that's essentially branding your show woke, where you bring out an actor and there's like, this person is playing this role and they are in fact, now look how amazing and progressive this is, when in fact what's actually happening is the same story that we keep telling over and over and over again.
Right. Just with more color on stage, or different color on stage or something. Yeah. One of the things you mentioned in the middle and then at the end, which we'll get to that version of it, is the write what you know, that trope of you should write what you know.
Right.
And the notion that this is what white writers know is this version of the black experience.
Right. Well, and it's funny because I reference that I, as a writer, tend to lean towards imagined worlds, right? I am more interested in shows in which the race of the characters is not the story. And I think that my draw towards that is my own. This is part of my own dismantling my own sort of internal racism and my internal anti-blackness that sort of tells me certain things about certain bodies. And as I sort of examined the way that I thought about bodies, the more it became clear to me that I was like, oh, I've been tricked, right? It feels good. You know, I make it sound in the essay like I was like very clear about this as soon as I did Hairspray. But the fact of the matter is that I did Hairspray and I didn't really register this thing while I was doing it, because it felt good for me to be on stage and singing about my culture. Like, I was like, yay, I'm playing a black person for the first time. This means something to me. This feels good to me. And then I like look back on it and I'm like, well, what was I doing with my body in that case? And the first question that I had about it was, how can I possibly, as a light-skinned person, sing the blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice in good conscience, right? Like, I'm sitting on stage and I'm like, I can't see why people look at me and only see the color of my face. You sing Run and Tell That, which is Seaweed's big song. And in it, I'm like, yes, I'm so dark. And I was like, I look back on that moment and I see pictures of me in the show and I'm like, look at the black people actually, like, they're so much darker than me. Like, what is Seaweed saying? And I remember actually I made a joke in rehearsal where I was like, this seems weird. I'm like, the blacker the berry, the sweeter the juice, except for any of those people, because don't pay attention to that, because I'm the black. It's just like, making jokes about it. And I sort of made a sort of toss off comment to the director and the creative team about it. And they were like, well, you're black. And I was like, yeah, cool. And I look back on that and I'm like, whoa. Like, not all black bodies are the same thing. And if you truly think that, then we have a much bigger problem on our hands. And that's sort of where this is like, this, you get into this nitty gritty where you're like, what do we know?
Yeah, well, and when the system has been putting these shows through that do make black people into a monolith,
right?
Like, then it is just like, well, yeah, well, you're black, so I guess you can do any of these things, and it doesn't matter, right?
And it's it's a wild thing, because I talk about writing what being a sort of a challenging piece of advice. But I think that the reason that I really think that's a challenging piece of advice is not necessarily because you can't imagine things. I think that the writer, actually, I think that humans have a remarkable gift for empathy. We are very good at imagining other people's experience, right? That's why we like theater, I think. That's why we like storytelling in general. We're very good at imagining what we aren't. And so the notion of the write what you know advice, to me, is so born into the sort of American individualism. Like, you need to be unique and special, and the way to be special is to speak to the thing that only you can speak to, which is your experience. That's where, so the write what you know becomes about personalizing all stories that you tell. And I think that that's important, right? That's a good piece of advice, especially for young writers, as they're like they're like, I want to write things. And you're like, okay, you need to learn how to like say your ideas. And the easiest way to do that is to be clear about what your ideas are, and to think about that in terms of what you know to be true about yourself. So the idea that I just think that sort of piece of advice was a seed that was planted and has grown into this sort of horrifying tree, that like people are not allowed to, the authenticity argument, that people are not allowed to imagine outside their experience, which is simply not true and also not helpful. It doesn't help anybody to say you can't imagine outside your experience. The thing is that, there's that. All being said, I am not here saying like, hey, white writers, go and write stories about black people. That is not at all what I'm suggesting. I'm simply suggesting that you need to sort of continue to engage with why and how you think about the stories that you're telling.
Yeah, I actually have an experience of I lead talkbacks all the time at Village. Anytime we do a reading or a developmental production, and at a certain point in the talkback process, I get to a question about artist intent versus audience intent, like what you want the show to be about versus what the artist wants the show to be about. And I normally say, like, if you want to go and write a show about whatever this show is about, go for it.
Right.
And you can write it and send it to me, but this is this person's version of that show. Totally. I did that for one particular show, and one of the creative team, the first performance of the show, came up to me afterwards. They're like, you run a great talkback. Please don't suggest people go and write a show about this.
Well, and it's a funny, because it's like, what I love about that piece of feedback is that what they're saying, like, be critical about the words that you're using to make the point you're making, right? Yeah. And I think that's sort of if I have a thesis in my life, that is it, where I'm like, it's not that you can and can't use certain words. It's that I want you to be critical about the words that you use. I want you to be critical about the way you think about the thing. There isn't a right way to do this. It is simply a way, and you need to be able to understand that people are going to react to that. Audiences are going to have an opinion. It's funny. I think about audience's relationship to the development of musicals a lot, right? Which I'm sure you think about often, because when you show an audience a work in progress, the audience feels like they've seen a product. There is actually no way to avoid that. The audience is in fact seeing a product. They're seeing a done deal, and that many audiences like to feel like they're engaged in the process of the creation, and they are. I'm not like they feel like they're not. Like, it just creates this really interesting dynamic, because it isn't the audience is there to actually help you craft the words you want to use. They're not there to tell the story. So I think about it in terms of like my essay. Part of the reason I'm so willing to talk about my essay is that my essay is not meant to be, I am truly speaking only of my experience in the world and my assessment of these things, and I put it out as a sort of offering for conversation. When I sent it to my sisters, or when I sent it to my friends, my other writer friends and my director friends about it, and then I had a conversation about it, that gave me space to, here's a specific example. Originally in the essay, I actually listed the creators as I went through the shows. So I talked about the fact that white-bodied people were creating the shows the whole time. And what I learned was that when I was talking about the white-bodied creators, people were thinking that the essay was about the fact that there needed to be more. They spent the time being like, yes, we need more Black creators. And that's actually not what the essay is about. So what I realized is that I actually pulled out all references to the color of the bodies of the creators until the very end, at which point what I try and do is basically show that if I tell my own story in these terms, I actually tell the story of my own exceptionalism. I am telling the story of an extraordinary Black creator who knows X, Y, and Z things now and like is ready to do the thing. And that becomes super problematic, because when I look at my body, I'm like, what happens when I put a light-skinned protagonist on stage, have two dark-skinned people teach him how to write, and then he goes forth and is like the winner at the end? What does that say about the bodies that you're using on stage? That's the question. And it's like, that can be my story, right? I'm telling a story. That's true. Like Heath, this version of Heath shows up at this group of these creators, and he's one of a small number of people who are a body of color. And in that context, it's like, look, the win at the end is they've been accepted into that space. And that, what are we saying about Blackness? What's the story of Blackness that's built into that story? And what does it mean by sort of me telling that story in that way?
This is a good segue into the one show that you have found that actually does deal with Blackness and Black bodies in a very specific way, but then also fails in other ways. And that show is Once on This Island.
So yeah, Once on This Island is a really interesting example, right? Because obviously Once on This Island starts to acknowledge the nature of colorism, right? Like it is explicit about the fact that there are Black bodies of different colors. And for that reason, I think when we see Once on This Island, we see it as being more representative of Blackness and the beautiful spectrum of Blackness available in the world, right? There's an illusion that, oh, we're seeing we're seeing a spectrum of Blackness. But the thing that I think Once on This Island still does is it tells the story of the experience of Blackness in terms of whiteness. So in the story of Once on This Island, light skin is associated with wealth and beauty and power, and Black skin is explicitly referred to as like less than, as
low as dirt is what they
they literally say, like they talk about Blackness, like this dark person is so dark, and it's like darkness is ugliness, and what's funny is that when you again remember who the audience of Once on This Island is, it is not like we're taking Once on This Island and we're going to Black communities and being like, y'all should think about colorism. That's not really what the show's about. The show is about love across borders, and the love across borders is, look at these rich white people, and again, I say white people because in the context of the show, the light-skinned Black body may as well be a white body. It is used in its proximity to whiteness in the like literal, from the history of the show. It's like they are lighter skinned because of the colonialism and because they are the bodies and the descendants of the French, right? They are functionally in the island of Once on This Island. They are white people. And it's interesting because a fascinating thing happened with the revival where a Black person, how much can I actually say about who did what? Basically, somebody had a critique of the Once on This Island show, and they were like, look, this dark girl just like falls in love with a white dude and like rolls out. And a number of people in the cast of Once on This Island and people who loved the show got up in arms because they were like, he's not white. And I was like, yes, one, the actor is not white. Two, in the context of the show, he's not white. But in the context of the story that we're telling here, operationally, he's white. And what's particularly strange about in the revival, I think that Isaac Cole Powell is extraordinary, right? This is an extraordinary actor, an extraordinary performer. The first time I saw Isaac Cole Powell on stage, I thought he was a white person. Mm-hmm. And that's not, I am not saying that takes anything away from his Blackness. He is a Black man. I saw him in a show that was an imagined world. So it was a show in which he was one of many diverse bodies. And in that show, he read to me as a white body. And that has everything to do with my reading of his skin, and like there's all of these things about why that's my own anti-Blackness that's associated with this, because there's all these challenges associated with that. But at the end of the day, your identity, the actor's identity, is actually not the thing that's in question here. It is how the audience sees the body. That's what matters. And that's a really, really crazy thing to try and wrap your head around. Like,
yeah. Well, and with Once on This Island in particular, there's a version of the show that is licensed that takes the racial component, the version of the racial component that is there,
right,
completely out of it. And
because the show isn't about race.
Right. And it makes it about rich and
poverty.
Poor,
right.
Wealth and poverty.
Right.
And literally it's so that anyone can do the show.
Totally.
You need to have a cast of 11 or 12 Black actors.
Incidentally, is that for me is the story of the system of whiteness, right? That is the system of white Broadway that wants to make the greatest profit possible on the show. The actual bodies on stage, the lives that it is mining for that story do not matter to the making of the money, which is actually what this is about. So we end up in this really strange situation where it's like, this story is so beautiful, and this culture, again, there's all of these wonderful things about the show. And I don't say these things to criticize any of the creators' craft of musical theater creation, or even their love of a culture and love of a people. The show still follows this track. It's a very simple story of Blackness, which is like, Black people suffer, and they will stop suffering when we stop seeing that they're Black.
Right. When you put it that, it's like so simple when you lay it out like that.
Yeah, it's really sort of horrifying when you like think of like once I started down this path, I was like, oh no, no, everything is just is like so overwhelmed by the weight of this project of whiteness that has infiltrated this whole system. And that's, that for me is like going back to why I reacted so strongly to the white American theater letter, is that I was like, this letter is part of the system. We're trying to criticize a system from inside of it. And that's really, really hard to do. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't try it because of that, because it's hard to do. It's simply like, this is always going to be hard. This is always going to be difficult. This is these conversations, the ones that we're having, that these things have facilitated, will have to keep happening. It's not like we're going to come back in 6 months and Broadway's going to be back and we're going to have fixed it. It's simply that we'll have to change the conversations that we choose to have when it comes to the development of theater.
Oh gosh, the system part of it is so mind-boggling. There's a story recently about a group of Black artists like a community is having conversations with all the artistic directors and artistic leaders in that community to try to figure out how to move forward and how to have like collective accountability and things like that. And of course, within that leadership, there's very little Black leadership and leaders of color. And so there was a side contingency of Black artists that got together to like, here are some things that you as leaders can do.
Right.
When that person brought when this Black person, Black leader brought that list to the leadership as a whole, they were like, what we have now realized is we just went and did this thing to give you advice within the structure of the world that you have created to do better as white people.
Right. We
had to go away as the Black people and then come to you to do better so that we can participate in the system.
Right.
And that's just like
yeah. I mean, systemic change.
Yeah.
It is a real, like, what to do of all of this is like so challenging. I mean, that's like, without going too wildly tangential, but that to me is like what the whole challenge with all of every political conversation that we have, right? It's like, what to do. There isn't really a fix to this. It's like we can only try things, and this is an experiment, and we should keep experimenting because that's what makes life fun. But
well, it's because it's going to be on everyone's TV on Friday. Hamilton is one thing that I did want to touch on briefly.
Yeah, Hamilton.
And your point of view on that, because it's really, Hamilton is seen as this huge, giant leap in progress towards diversity and inclusion and representation and all of that. But you bring up in your essay that there is also anti-Blackness within the way that Hamilton tells its story. So can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah. So I always have to go on record here. I think Hamilton's absolutely remarkable. I truly, like, I am not here, like, this is not a cancel Hamilton.
Yeah.
I do not hold that torch. I have no desire. Like,
I've seen it 3 times, and every time I've seen it from a standing room seat. And I prefer that because I have to be able to like walk away when I'm overwhelmed by
the craft of it is
on stage.
It's really remarkable.
Yeah.
So let's go on record and just be like, this is amazing. What Hamilton does, what Lin-Manuel has achieved, what Tommy Kail has achieved, what Andrew Blank Bueller, what the creators have done, remarkable.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I meant to say this earlier. It's like understanding like the term racism or the term anti-Blackness is not necessarily like a racist doesn't necessarily mean someone in a hood.
Right. Yes.
Right? It doesn't mean that you are a KKK member or you are like actively doing things purposefully or.
Yeah.
And the same thing with anti-Blackness. It's not like there's one level of anti-Blackness.
Yeah.
There's a million different.
Yeah, it's interesting. There are a number of thinkers who talk about this. So I'm going to be borrowing from a lot of places to sort of make my case here. But one of the things that's really interesting about whiteness in general is, and this is truly tangential, I will talk about Hamilton in a second, but whiteness is not an identity. Whiteness does not describe who people are in the same way that Blackness does in our culture. One of the things that I don't know if you followed, there was a whole moment with the essay where it got published, but it got edited and reposted.
We like messaged a little bit on Instagram about it.
Wild. So this real thing happened. It was truly insane, where they basically were like, "We love your essay. We're gonna publish it." And I was like, "Cool." And then they published it, and they had edited it in a way that I was like, "You did not read my essay, and it's important to me." And they were like, "Why are you being so difficult about this? You had, it has to be edited." And I was like, I'm not arguing that that I'm not, that there's things that can improve about the writing. I am not here to be like, I understand things. It no longer is the point that I was making. And they're like, I don't understand. Well, like, and one specific example is that I'm really particular about not capitalizing white, but I capitalize black. And people are like, why do you do that? And again, many people have many reasons for doing this. And a lot of it has, its baseline is respect. And for me, the baseline respect is that that there is not a black white binary. There's not, blackness as an identity is a thing that is attributed to people. Whiteness is not, especially when it comes to telling stories. So in storytelling, it makes it seem like there's a black man and there's a white man, like, right, or a black person and a white person. What is actually happening, the binary that we deal with in America is not a black person and a white person. It's a black person and then a person, right? And it's a man, right?
Yeah,
so there's
sure.
a man and then there's a black man. And this binary actually applies in relation to, basically there is cis white maleness and then there's another thing. So this happens to, there's a man and then there's a female man. That is actually literally how the breakdown of storytelling goes. So when female characters are on stage, they are always like, I'm a female character because of my relationship to manness. Trans characters are on stage in relation to cisness. Black people are on stage in relation to whiteness. This is all, gay people are on stage in relation to straightness. And all of those storytelling tricks that we use are all, so it's not actually it's not a 1-2. It's not like a binary. It's an identity and then a neutrality.
Right.
And it's really important to me to like make sure that we understand that when we talk about racism is not an identity. It's not about you. It's about all of this. Like when we talk about the system, like what is neutrality? Neutrality is racist. That's just a thing, and that's okay.
Yeah.
And you benefit from that. I benefit from that. I talk about this in terms of gender. I talk about it in terms of race. I gain benefits because of the way that my body intersects with culture. I am benefited by my maleness. I am benefited by my light skin. I am benefited by these, like all of these things they're all, that's how privilege works. So privilege is a system. It's not about like, I get things because again, that's like that individual mentality. It's not that I get something because of something. It's that people who operate in bodies like mine receive things on a causal relationship.
Yeah, my friend, I was having I had a socially distant outdoor dinner with a friend last week, and he was mentioning that his company is doing a lot of anti-racist training and equity, diversity, and inclusion, and all that kind of stuff. And they were given like a list of words that they're not allowed to use.
Right.
And they range from like powwow. Like powwow is
Right.
respectful to the Native community, and one of the words was female, and he was like, "What? Why can't I use the word female?" And they specifically said because it is so often used to differentiate from the neutral, like a female pilot.
Right.
If you just say a pilot, it's assumed in our culture that that's a man.
Yeah.
And so they specifically said like when you use female, it's often to specifically differentiate from the norm.
Yeah.
That's not helpful.
Well, this is actually an amazing, I'm going to just like loop this back around to the Hamilton conversation, because this is the beginning of my story with Hamilton, which is the first time I saw Hamilton, I was like blown away. I was like, this is amazing. Listened to it. I was like, dude, how does this man do this? This is amazing. I have my own aesthetic things about it, but they're my aesthetic things about music, which is like good. I love that. I disagree with like how music is used.
Yeah.
Funny things. One of my early critiques of Hamilton was actually that I think that Hamilton is like profoundly misogynistic. Like the use of women on stage is wild. Like, and it's funny because I was particularly upset by it in Hamilton, watching it, because example, in the Schuyler Sisters, Angelica Schuyler says, you know, when I meet Thomas Jefferson, I'm gonna compel him to include women in the sequel. Work. And everyone's like, yes. And the audience goes crazy. And everyone's like, yes, we love women. Which makes it seem like that's what the show's about in some way. Like that's like a yas women. And then at the end of the show, everybody was like crying around me. And because, you know, she's like, I put myself back in the narrative and I did this thing. And I was like, very cool. Pippa Sue, you are a gorgeous performer. What's happening? You breathe and I cry. It's very lovely. It is strange to me that you're bringing this female character to wrap up the show like she's been relevant to the actual thrust of the show, right? She's brought on stage. And it's funny because this is like all happening, right? Women exist in the show. They're like, there's the Schuyler sisters and like do the thing. And I like look back at the beginning of the show. You have every random man, every random tertiary character rolls up and gets his single line. And he's like, me, I fought for him. Me, I died for him. Me, I blah, 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 blah. And then the three women in unison roll up and they're like, me, I loved him. And I was like, hold on. No. You do not get to say when I meet Thomas Jefferson, you compel him to include women in the sequel and then homogenize every female in this entire show as relational to this, their love for this man. That is what happens in Hamilton. And that bothered me, right? I was like, come on. Like what are we doing? And then there's like the whole thing about like female actors wanting to play. There's the whole thing about casting and like whether you can change. And they're like, we can't change the keys. And you're like, everybody changes the keys. I don't understand what we're talking about. It's a whole thing. Anyway, but like that. So my first criticisms of Hamilton were tied to specifically the use of femaleness in the show, female characters. And then it was funny because like when I started applying these thoughts about the way that racialized bodies are used on stage, one of the things about Hamilton that stresses me out is that Hamilton is very specifically about, you know, it's a historical moment, and this particular historical moment is the beginning of, you know, what's happening right now, right? Colonialism that created the transatlantic slave trade, in which they literally built a country using enslaved people. That is what happened. And then Hamilton exists in this time. And in Hamilton, they unambiguously refer to blackness. You know, John Lawrence talks about the first Black Battalion. There's a winkish moment to Sally. Thomas Jefferson has the winking moment about his love for the black body. Like there's all these things that happen in the show that say we know racism, but then I'm like, Hamilton owned slaves. Like Hamilton had enslaved people. He enslaved people. That happened. So there's this weird thing for me now when I interact with Hamilton where I'm like, we can't call this it actually exists. It like sort of pretends like it's a real world, but it's absolutely an imagined world in which slavery is just not related to the body, right? And that, to me, that very straight, the problem with that message is that it means that being enslaved was related to something else, some failure of those people who were enslaved, right? And you can see how it's like, as I keep going down this logic path where you're like, so is Hamilton arguing then that the people who were enslaved because they lacked something that people like Aaron Burr and Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson did not lack? And you end up in this like weird mess of a bowl where you're like, what are we talking about anymore? And the funny thing is that, again, nobody thinks about this when they watch Hamilton. So it's not like, I'm not like Hamilton is racist, but you look at this thing and then you're like, blackness is sort of ignored in this show. And then we run into the problem, which is that the four main creators of the show, which are Lin-Manuel Miranda, Tommy Kail, Andy Blankenbuehler, and Alex Lacamoire, are for people who exist in white bodies or very close to white proximity. And that gets into this like, oh no, these are for cis white men who are existing in and making the decisions about this thing. So when you think about the relationship, the way that the breakdown of the actors happen, and again, to say that Lin-Manuel is white, is afforded white privilege, to me is not about taking away from his Latinx identity at all. I have again, racism in our country operates in many different ways, largely in proximity to blackness. American racism is largely in proximity to American blackness. So even when Irish people were discriminated against, they were discriminated against as being in relation to black people, right? So you ended up with this weird double talk where poor white people were able to consider themselves better because of the hierarchy of, right? That hierarchy is established by the powers, the historical, wealthy, rich, white landowner, right? It's a whole thing. But for me, that's when I say like Lin-Manuel having proximity to whiteness is important in this conversation, because it's not about, and again, it's not trying to take away from the real experiences of racism that people of color, including Latinx people, have experienced. But Latinx actually refers to people from an area of the world. It's a geographic thing. And the thing is that a Latinx person could look like anything, right? Like anyone could be Latinx, because turns out different colonialism screwed up the whole of the Americas. So like, it's not like it's not like there's a, but again, it's important to me to be able to point to this and to be able to talk about it without it seeming like what I'm doing is attacking somebody's experience of sex.
Right. The thing you said, I actually wrote it down. Where it is? That in Hamilton, all the bodies are created equal, and they're, because of that, the trappings of blackness are ignored.
Right.
And because there is someone has a question about color conscious versus color blind casting, which I think we'll get to like later. But like, in whatever version of color conscious versus color blind, that there's sort of like a color consciousness in that, like, we're specifically casting the principals in this show as people of color. But then there's also a blindness in that kind of any person of color can kind of be any of those roles.
Right.
There's kind of a traditional way that Eliza tends to be lighter skinned, Angelica tends to be darker skinned, but then on Broadway, Danae Benton is playing. So like, but there is a sort of like blindness within the casting of those principals, at least,
right?
That doesn't allow you to confront the blackness of any of them,
right? Well, and it's actually remarkable. I mean, it's funny because, you know, this creates this like it's a real challenge. Like, what do you do, right? There's no way to win. There's like, if Hamilton has,
if they can't figure it out,
if they didn't figure it out, like what's going to be done, and that for me is actually like part of the point here, is that like it's not important to me. Again, Broadway theater creators want it to be like, when I do the right thing, I will in fact be above reproach because the thing will have happened. And I was actually just, one of the conversations that I was having with some creators just last week, I was like, so you know, it's really important when I do diversity consulting, the first thing that I say, right, is like, I'm like, okay, so you, my friends, have brought me on into this show, and I am a Black person, and I now will empower everything that I'm doing, will seem like I'm empowering the choices you're making. And I'm like, it is deeply important to me that before we start doing any discussion about dramaturgical stuff, about how this is going to actually play out in the context of the show, that you are aware that I do not absolve you of this conversation in the future. I am not here to make it be like, we did the thing, we brought the Black person on,
check the box,
check it. And it's like, I do not give you that benefit. I'm glad that you've brought me here as an articulate person who can talk about this in these ways, but I am not everyone. And you will find when the next reading of this show that you've done, you are going to run into these problems again. You're going to run into everything here because a different body is going to be in the space and they're going to experience this differently. So one of the people I was brought on as a script doctor because they were like, we're not sure that these jokes land. And I was like, okay, so I can't tell you that they land. I can only tell you that you are using a black body as the butt of a joke. People might think it's funny. Black people might think it's funny. I am not here to tell you what you should or shouldn't do. I'm only here to try and reframe what it is you're doing on stage. So when I think about looking forward from what my essay is actually talking about, it's really important to me that people are like, so if we can't do an imagined world and we can't do a real world, what are you supposed to do? And I'm like, it's actually not about whether you make a decision that your show takes place in a real world or show takes place in an imagined world. It's about giving you new language to talk about what it is you're actually doing. Because if you want a character to not see the blackness of another character, that is a valid thing to do on stage. You're allowed to believe that should happen, right? I am not here to tell you that you should never cast any person of color unless they are seen as their whole body. I have no desire to have that conversation. All that I'm sort of pointing to is that, like, you creators have chosen to put a body on stage, and that body in this context has this implication for a lot of people. That's what I'm trying to talk about. And they're like, so what? Fine, we'll just do it as an all white with all white people. And I'm like, and then that choice is the other side of the problem, because you believe. And again, to speak directly to Dear Evan Hansen. Dear Evan Hansen did their out of town tryout with an entirely white cast, and they got called out. And what they did was they replaced the absolute most tertiary character with a black person. That's an insane choice, right? Because now they're like, look, we don't have an entirely white cast. And it's like, no. And it's funny because I sit there and I'm like, look, honestly, if you're going to make this argument, it would have been better if you had it all white people, because then you because that's actually what you're doing. Right. It's not better by doing this. I use as an example of a show that I loved that happened to be all white people was Heroes of the Fourth Turning. And Heroes of the Fourth Turning, which is at Playwrights Horizons, is about 5 white people, essentially. And people are like, you just hate shows that are all white. And I'm like, no, I hate shows that use whiteness as neutral, or they use blackness as a choice. That's what I don't like. So if your show happens to be about all white people, by all means, tell your show that's all about white people. Just know that I will straight up call you out for being interested only in shows about white people, which is
right. Sort of the, yeah.
Right. It's like, but at least you're being honest about what you're doing. I would much rather deal with that conversation than the conversation where you're like, no, we're not racist because we did X, Y, and Z things. I'm like,
yeah, totally. Well, keeping on Dear Evan Hansen, are there more than one? There's been one high-profile Evan Hansen.
Right. Yeah.
And there are also other understudies and standbys that have been of color. Mm-hmm. How do you respond to an Evan Hansen casting where, oh gosh, now I'm blanking on
Jordan Fisher.
Yes, Jordan Fisher, who played it on Broadway, who's black. Yeah, very light skinned.
Yeah,
I'm not sure what his actual makeup is, but how do you deal with, like, what's your take on that when his I assume there weren't any rewrites done.
No, he just does the show because the show isn't about black. Like, there's no reason why that role can't be anybody, right? You can. I mean, there are. Yeah, I mean, there's really, you can do whatever. My thing about that particular situation is the thing that I point to with the problem with what's going on there is that they have put a person of color in that show. I am not in the conversation. I am not present for the conversations that go into why or why not, why they do or don't do whatever they've done with the show, right? Everybody's like, this person is great. I have no real desire to talk about any. Again, I think Pascal and Paul are some of the greatest craftspeople working in musical theater right now, right? There's no, they're also white dudes. So the thing about the Jordan Fisher thing that I point to is that the person who did the role immediately before Jordan Fisher was a literal high schooler, literally plucked out of high school to go and play this role. Also amazing. Love Andrew. He's amazing. Go him. He is an absolute unknown quantity. When you put the Black person into the show, you went with a well-established industry performer. And I go, okay, so what does this tell us about the story you're telling yourselves about Blackness? You literally, because you can't argue that this unknown plucking out of high school was about like, you're like, he's not going to bring money in, right? Like, I mean, not on his, again, he's great, but that's literally not how like, producing works. He's not a name. He's just like, you can tell an interesting story about like having a high schooler in the role. And I know from a number of my friends who have auditioned for and role for a show in many contexts, many of them have been told they are too old for the show because they're like 27, apparently doesn't read as high school, but they really only don't read as high schooler when they're across from a 16-year-old.
Right.
So when you put a 16-year-old, anyway, the point is that, so there's this weird like purity clause that they're like, no, we just, Andrew's amazing. And Andrew is amazing. But they didn't go and find a random Black high schooler. That did not happen.
Right.
And it wouldn't, because the only way I imagined the story, again, I'm not present for those conversations, but I imagine that these conversations go like, well, if we're going to do something, we really got to get like, because again, I, without talking a lot about what happened in Comet, I was privy to this very specific conversation that happened that was absolutely anti-Black when they replaced the Black body that was in our lead with an old white person who could in fact sell tickets. It was a financial decision, but that financial decision was racist.
Mm-hmm.
And that for me is that's when I talk about what's happening with Dear Evan Hansen, it's hard for me to think about it in terms of like this isolated experience is a choice in which they did something that is good or bad. And instead being like, no, this choice was made as part of a racist system. And them making that choice doesn't absolve them from the racist system that they're perpetuating by making the choice that they did. Mm-hmm. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's really fascinating. I never thought about it in that context of like, of what you just said, of finding like a totally unknown, untested white teenager, but then for a Black person to be able to play that role, they must have 3 million Instagram followers or whatever, right? That's that plays into the narrative of Black excellence needing to be so high in order,
which is true, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely.
I mean, there's an amazing video that just came out with Viola Davis talking about.
Like,
she's like, I have an Tony Awards. I have an Oscar. Pay me. Like, you're like a Black Meryl Streep, and she's like, great, pay me. Like, I'm like, yeah. Which it's funny to like see that, but it's like, no, this system is so broken that we're unable to like, because I bet people like look at Viola Davis and they're like, why is she so angry? She's wealthy, right? And you're like,
but how wealthy would she be if she was white?
Right. Which is like,
yeah,
it's wild. It's a wild time to be alive.
Yeah, I'm like, we're definitely over an hour.
Oh yeah, look, I can talk about this all the time.
And also when the two of us get together, like we always.
Yeah, I don't know what you thought. It sounds like, oh shit.
Oh, it's fine. I have a couple like random other little questions, and maybe we can like. Well, here actually, someone mentioned it earlier. So we have our first question I can put on the screen. Colorblind and color conscious casting.
Oh, this is an interesting question.
Yeah, like what do you consider color blind and color conscious? And
Yeah.
do you think they should have a standard definition? Is one, like, I have my own opinions about this, but like, is one out of date? Is one not? Are they both out of date? Are they both relevant but different
This is
things?
a fascinating question. Here's what I will say about this. So language is funny, and I think that the desire for colorblind and color conscious casting to be standardized is not really gonna help us in a explicitly. And the reason I say that is because you actually vaguely in our little pre-show, you vaguely asked me about equity, diversity, and inclusion.
Mhm.
And my feeling about the language is that the use of the language has diluted the intention of the language. So in the case of the reason color conscious became a thing was because color blind got diluted in its practice, right? The intention behind colorblind casting was good, he says tentatively. The effect wasn't great because it wasn't actually being done consciously, which was the point of
Right.
color conscious casting. So to shift to color conscious casting is only more useful if it implies consciousness. The intentionality surrounding the use of color, I think, is just really important to understand that you are using color. That is using people. And that's just the nature of it. So to specifically standardize the definition, the need for the standard definition, I would argue, is part of the challenge.
Mhm. It's like
Because
systemizing system.
yeah, like
It's like incorporating this systemically is
right.
sort of making it a continued part of the problem.
Right, exactly. It's a challenge, right? So I'm sitting here and like I even sitting here I'm like, this is not a satisfying answer. But at
Yeah.
the same time, I like one of the things that I is deeply important to me. And again, I'm like clearly I this is like I'm a language freak. I like love words. That's why I love words in relation to storytelling. I love words in relation to themselves. I love Scrabble. I just like really like words. One of the things that I talk a lot about is that like it's really important to be conscious about the words that you use in the moment that you use them. So, and you're not going to always succeed at being conscious about the words that you're trying to use because you have definitions in your head. But I think that part of the sort of letting go of the getting it right part of this is like allowing that space of if something is confusing or something is not understood, allowing that to be a space of more deeper interest. Like continue to try and find between you and your social circles, you and your friends, you and your partners, you and your the people who are your employees, you and your coworkers. Continue to try and find language. Continue to try and analyze and pull apart this language. So I sort of like I'm double talking in my answer to the question, which is like I'm like, yes, colorblind and color conscious are different concepts. It is, to my mind, more important to be color conscious than it is to be colorblind. But if being color conscious creates a weird rubric that you like then check off to like get your 17 black people in the show that you need to make it
Hmm.
right,
Hmm.
it's not going to do it for me. So like conscious about color conscious would be like my addendum, I guess.
Maybe just think about it
Yeah.
and have like a reason and
Yeah.
have it
And
be
that, yeah,
just
and that for me is like that keeps going back to that point, which is like this is about consciousness. This is about calling out a system, not calling out people, so that the people can better call out themselves and people can better push against that system.
Right. Well, and like, my understanding of like how within the system, colorblind and color conscious are like different. If we're getting to like definitions,
Yeah, for sure.
like the way that I've understood it is colorblind is like ignore race. Race isn't a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody can do anything, and it doesn't matter.
Right.
Whereas color conscious is being aware of like what a black body in that role means for the storytelling.
Yeah.
Or what an Asian body looks like in that role, or whatever the but this is also connecting it to some sort of neutral version of like, oh, the neutral is white.
Right.
So what does that mean? To me, it mostly, most of the musical theater canon is written with white as neutral.
Yeah.
Just because that's the way that the canon was.
By most of the musical theater canon, we mean
all.
Okay.
Except for the 4 shows that we've kind of been talking about. But yeah, so I mean, the musical theater canon is
white central. Yeah, it's just white.
And white is the neutral. I had lost my train of thought. I don't remember where I was going with this.
No, I think you were defining the color blind versus color conscious, and that, which I think is dead on. And I would just add to that, which is like what color conscious does as a term is it points out that color blindness is impossible. Like, so I guess sort of in my specific answer, I would be like, colorblind is not a thing. It's just not it. I understand the intentionality behind it. It's just not a thing. So like, strike it from the lexicon.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been getting in without getting like too personal, I've been getting into like a few Facebook arguments with people lately.
Yeah, we love them.
And it's somehow wanting to. It's like you can't. I don't think you can exist in the world and pretend that like race is not a thing.
Right.
I don't know how you could exist in the world today and not think and try to pretend like, oh, everyone is the same and equal, and if we just stop talking about it, it won't be a thing.
Yeah.
And so to try to take that and put it into some kind of theatrical context makes even less sense to me.
Yeah.
When the whole point is to be intentional about storytelling,
right?
Why you would try to think that it's not a thing you have to worry about.
Yeah, and I would actually, like, again, as I point to like words, for me, it's like, I don't think that anybody should be worried about it, right? This is my goal is to not make people stressed. It's actually to just be like, no, literally, this is you're already doing this. You're already telling stories in your head, in your heart, in your spirit, into your audiences. You're already doing this. My question is, what is the story you're telling? And do you want to be telling that story? And some people will be like, I want to keep telling that story. And I'll be like, okay, I don't want to hear it. I'm not going to go see that show. I have not seen the Green Book. I have no desire to see the Green Book. People are like, but it was Oscar nominated. I'm like, so it's the story is the story. And they're like, but if you see the actual, it's so much more nuanced. And I'm like, I don't care. This is actually funny because, again, I've been having this conversation about gender for years, in a way that I haven't about race, as explicitly about race. Again, my own work. One of the things that I like got really worked up about was Pretty Woman. Like, there were, I mean, we can talk about it in terms of Tootsie or in terms of Mrs. Doubtfire, where I'm like, you understand, like, I get the money-based reason to tell this story again. You understand that, like, the story of Pretty Woman is the story of a rich man buying a prostitute out of poverty. That is what happens. That's not, there's no part of the story that's not that. And people are like, when they were doing it and they were talking about, like, we're going to make it a story of female empowerment. And I was like, okay, but the story is still it's still the story. Right? I'm not quite sure how you're going to make it not about that. And it's funny, people are like, what would you do if you were adapting it right now? And I was like, honestly, if you asked me to adapt Pretty Woman right now, what I would do is I would do a verbatim transcript of the movie. I would do it verbatim. I'd score the entire thing. I would do like a, like they do with the what's that London it's a type of musical theater where they basically just take actual exactly as it's written and they just score it. And like, so you then sing it. It's a really cool version. I'll find it. I'll tell you about it later. But I would basically take the movie, basically make it a full score, just do the movie exactly, and then just have only women do it. Just only female identifying people. And then have people be like, wait, so this story is about a dude buying a woman out of prostitution. I'd be like, yes, that is what the story is. This is the show that you love. It's why I like, it's like for all of the things that you can feel what you feel about the Oklahoma revival, the thing that I like about it is that it basically just aggressively is like, this is the show that you like. And I'm like, if you're gonna do it, just show them the show. Don't try and make it seem like the show is something that it's not, just so that you can feel better about the fact that you're doing it. Like, do the thing. Like, if you want to get the money by doing Little Pretty Woman on stage, do Pretty Woman on stage by all means, but don't pretend like you're doing something different than what it is. That for me is like, and that for me is the thing about Tootsie. That's the thing about that Doubtfire. I'm like, you understand that you're doing this thing. That's what's happening. You are doing a show in which the joke is that a male-bodied person pretends to be a woman. That's the joke. It's funny because like people are like, whoa, I want to fix it. I'm like, you either do it or don't. I think
no matter how pure the intentions of that character, it is still about the same. It's still
right. You're
still
like,
thing, yeah.
It would be like bizarre if somebody was like, let's adapt Birth of a Nation and make it like,
but make it
what is wrong with you? They're just like I mean, okay, like we can like analyze the choice. Again, if a bunch of black people decided to like do Birth of a Nation on stage and it was like a black theater doing black, like, and they were like, we're gonna just do Birth of a Nation, see what happens. I'd be like, yes, probably would hate it, but I would be like, by all means do it.
Yeah.
Go. My friend.
We have another question. I'm not totally clear what the question is, but it'll probably start a good conversation.
Oh, hi, Russell.
Do you think creators use the racism of the public, tourists, as an excuse for the stories they tell, or are excuses not even necessary?
Oh, interesting.
I don't totally understand the second part of it, but like but do you think creators use the racism of the public, meaning the people that are consuming the show, do you think that they use that as an excuse of like, well,
yes,
they want these stories, so I'm going to give them these 100%.
Stories? Absolutely. There's no question here. I mean, it's funny. Yeah. It's funny. My interpretation of the second half of the question is that like the excuses aren't necessary is about like, do we think that they're consciously doing this, or is it an unconscious choice? And I actually think it's quite conscious a lot of times. I think that people are. I mean, I have been told in setting like again as an actor, I have been told things that are like, people will see your body in this role, and that means something. And I'm like, hi, sorry, don't talk to me about that. Like. I mean, literally, and again, I'm a unique performer in the sense that I'm like, I give so few, I just do not care. I will absolutely push back on director. Like if a director tells me to do something I'm uncomfortable with, I'm like, I'm not uncomfortable with that. And I will explain to them why. That is not a thing that I believe that all actors should be expected to do. Right. I just don't, if I get fired, I'm like, okay, but that's a privilege. That's privilege talking, right? My ability to do that is privilege. But I have been in situations where a director has basically said, this is what it means for your body to be in this space. And I've just been like, hi, if you would like to have a conversation about that outside the context of this rehearsal process, I am happy to explain to you exactly why what you just said to me is extremely problematic. But I don't think that you're intending anything problematic by it. I don't think that there's anything like, it's not really about you and I in this moment. Like, I totally hear you. I understand what you're trying to. This is not a conversation that's going to be helpful to you. And I'll just tell people that, which is, again, unique.
I mean, I prefer it. I would.
Right. I mean, I would prefer it from somebody insane.
Yeah.
But also,
Yeah. I have a couple other questions that I wanted to get to, and then
Yeah.
we will end this.
No, I'm having a great time. I don't go to sleep until 2 a.m. anyway, so we're like set. This is the end of my day.
Which one do I go to first? How does all of this? We started touching on this with like color conscious versus colorblind, that kind of thing. But like, how does all of this information tie into revivals? We've mostly been talking about these shows as they exist, as they're being created as new work. So how does this idea of blackness, anti-blackness, the body on stage relate to revivals? And like, you know, do you think we still need things like a Black Ariel, or like where is the we're shifting the conversation away from creating things to then how does this, if the canon exists?
Yeah. I think this is a really great question, and I think it's particularly. I mean, like, I think you specifically have a very unique relation to this because regional theater has an interesting obligation to.
Well, I mean,
no. I mean, it's just complicated, right? Like, it's a subscriber base. The whole thing is complicated. So I guess what I would say is when you can sort of do two, for my mind, you could sort of do two things with a revival. You can try and recreate the thing that was loved in the cultural moment that it was loved, right? Like you can,
like,
and to me,
revival.
Like the Hello Dolly revival is a great example.
Or the Music Man revival, that seems to be.
Or the Music Man revival, also example of it. You can do that. I am not at all interested in that. So I just am like, and you could basically argue we can make money doing this thing, and therefore we should do, like, everything about it is like, if you're trying to make money, stop doing theater. This is like a terrible business venture. Just seems really like literally 80% of shows fail. I don't understand what your problem is. Clear. Anyway, so there's that. But so like you can do that. And I find if that's your attitude, if that's why you are doing what you're doing, I'm a little suspect of people being like, and now we have Audra McDonald playing this role. Or I'm like, now this is not about, you're just trying to jump on this cultural trend moment. Like that is what that is. So the version of like, let's do the thing that we loved again, I just am like, no, I don't want to. I'm not interested. I don't care. Get it out of here. That being said, the sort of second version of this, which is for me the one that's interesting to me, and the one that if somebody said to me, one must do revivals, like I have a version of I have like a list of shows that I want to do. Like if everybody's like, Heath, you can direct, but you can only direct something that people love. I'm like, give me Sound of Music right now. I'm just gonna piss a lot of people off. Like and like that's like how I
music.
What?
What's your Sound of Music?
Oh, do I want to give this to you? I think that
you don't have to share. You don't have to share. Line so that it's not like.
They'll be like, right. I'll tell you about my Sound of Music later. Okay. But I have like a number of shows that I'm like, if somebody's like, you must do one of the classics, I'd be like, okay, I'm gonna do this one, and then I'm just gonna piss everyone off by the way that I actually engage with this piece.
Okay.
And for me, that's actually the thing that I'm interested in revivals. I think that there is something very musical theater specifically, that has this very strange thing where we have like a conscious cultural moment that we can then be in conversation with in a new moment, right? We can like put the thing on stage and we're like then having a conversation with people's perception of the thing that they think that they once saw. It's just this weird, like what is actually happening in the revival is a really confusing thing. But we talked about this where like things that happen in classic musicals are different, right? There's like, you have a charm song that is literally there to be charming because audiences at the time were like, we've had too many ballads in a row.
Yeah, they needed
a charm song. And it's funny because you can see the vestiges of that kind of choice. Like Officer Krupke happening in Act 2 of West Side Story is 100% about this understanding of musical theater, right? Like there's no, people are like, oh no, but it makes sense. And I'm like, it makes sense because they were like, we have to do something here so that this doesn't.
They needed a break.
Right. And they made a great choice, right? And I think that this is like one of the things that I think Sondheim does uniquely well is that he makes really smart story choices about what is necessary in the arc of the musical. Mm-hmm. Super here for that. So when we re-examine revivals, I'm really like interested in turning things on its head, trying things like I have an Anything Goes. I will share my Anything Goes because I came up with my Anything Goes. Have I talked to you about Anything Goes?
I don't think so. I've talked a lot about Anything Goes, but I don't think it's with you.
I wanted to do I had this idea that back when I was in Hairspray, actually, that's what you should basically cast a drag queen or a trans woman as Reno, because in the show, there's like these weird explicit references to people being like, she's a low woman. Like people like the highbrow people on the ship have this very strange relationship to class and Reno. And I think it would just be fascinating to see what happens if you don't, literally the only thing that you do is just like put Peppermint as Reno. Like what happens to the show? And then with Peppermint have a conversation about what the story of that show is. So like basically center the development of and the sort of exploration of what's happening in the revival with a sort of specific conversation with a specific person, and like put and see what happens to the show when you do that. And like be ready to be the fact that like you're going to run yourself into there's going to be you're going to run into problems. There's going to be all sorts of things that become a challenge, but be very like particular about like, we're explicitly doing the show as like, let's say we're doing the 67 fucking rewrite because there were 12 rewrites. You choose a rewrite of the show and you do it exactly as written. You don't try and fix it. You just do things that make the show itself really uncomfortable, where it's like, what happens when we do this? And then you just have to make sure that you have a relationship with your actors, that you're understanding that they know what the goal is of the piece, so that you're not like throwing them on stage and then being like, haha, we're just going to have you screw with.
Right. And then it's going to be uncomfortable. And
it just creates, you have to be very particular with how you interact with the space you create with that. But that's the sort of kind of revival that I'm interested in. I'm like, because then people would like come away and be like, this person was bad. And I'd be like, you're racist. There's like these wonderful things that you can engage with people on a different level, because they'll be like, when I saw Anything Goes, and I'm like, cool. How was that for you? And they're like, oh, this was X, Y, and Z things. So I'll be like, yeah. And they're like, oh, but this performer was bad. And I was like, that's objectively not true, but carry on. Like,
well, I can't wait until we're off of here so I can hear your Sound of Music idea.
Yeah, that's wild.
I have a friend that I will tell you their Singing in the Rain idea, but I won't do it publicly because it's far too good for someone to steal.
Right, you can't have people steal it.
Yeah, exactly.
Also, I really want somebody to do Anything Goes with Peppermint. Like, go get Peppermint.
I'm full.
Fascinated.
Yeah.
See what happens.
Okay, one final question, and then we'll go.
Yeah.
Flipping forever. How do you feel about characters that are written as any race?
Well, it's my bread and butter.
or a person of color.
That's two different things. One, the written as a person of color is one of my least favorite things in the world, because essentially what's happening when that's what's happening is that essentially the writers are like, we, because it's 2020, have to cast more people of color. This role could be a person of color. Let's cast it as a person of color. That to me drives me up a wall. I'm like
requiring casting.
Yeah, right. It's just so afterthoughty. Like you're just like, The first one, which is this role can be any race, I'm much more interested in. It's almost all. I'm very thus far in my writing. I'm pretty particular about writing all of my roles are for any race. That being said, I'm also very particular about, once we step into the casting process, being very, very active about what it means to see. Like, if you have a bunch of people come in for the show, this happened when I was auditioning for it at Nymph. This was like a whole thing, because I actually originally didn't want to be in it, and we just ran into this problem.
Heath has a beautiful show called Newton's Cradle.
Oh, sorry. I wrote a show called Newton's Cradle.
Newton's Cradle.
Yeah, check out the Saunders Collective. Yay, me. But one of the things that I actually originally didn't really want to be in it, because I wanted to be able to sort of sit on the outside of it. And what we found was, literally just in the audition process, the forever problem of casting, which is like, we literally just didn't have people come in for it. And if I had been in a position where we had more money or more access, or like ways to sort of expand the outreach of it, there are things that we could have done. But the fact of the matter is that in the context of what we had and the money that we had, and like, we didn't have enough money to do more days of auditioning. So it was literally like this, like, no. And this conversation had been percolating for many reasons. It was like, the show is a really, really heavy sing, and it was like, I didn't want to teach. We had so little time. Like, there was all these reasons, but one of those big reasons was like, we didn't want the show to be all white. Like, we just didn't. It was just important to us that not be the case, even though it could be done all, like, it doesn't matter. Like, Newton's Cradle specifically doesn't particularly matter. We're just really active about that particular conversation.
Are you particular, like, say all the roles are any race, are you particular about, like, the context, like, if a Black person is in this role, that means that this other role must be this race or that race? Like,
yes,
is there some kind of puzzle to that? Or
yes, and which is that the puzzle, there is a puzzle to it, which is like, when you put certain bodies in certain roles, it does mean certain things. And there are I mean, we had can I tell this story? No. I'll tell a different story. A really interesting thing happened when we actually did one reading of the show. We're really active. Again, we've been active about like doing different arrangements of the color in Newton's Cradle. And one version of the show featured randomly almost entirely Latinx identifying people. It was very strange. I was like, oh, that happened. So actually a number of people in the show that time thought that it was meant to be a Latinx show. And we were like, oops, that was weird. It was a great version of it. It wasn't like problematic. Sure. It was just like, it was weird to talk to the actors about it, because they had this experience that they were like, oh, and they actually thought, one person actually thought that I was Latinx because of it. I was like, no. But in that version of the show, we had a dark-skinned body in one role who at the time, and actually still does, has this, there's a thread in the show where this particular character tells a story over and over and over again in the show. And the story that they tell is a story about a raven or a crow that goes to the ocean to live among seagulls. And in that story, it's a blackbird that goes to the ocean to be, and the original song literally was like, there's this bird, this blackbird that's from the forest, goes and makes its home on the sea, and there's all these white and gray seagulls on the ocean, and this blackbird always felt, and it's like, and the whole story of the song Blackbird was like, this blackbird shows up at the ocean, and the white and gray seagulls, they accept the blackbird. They're like, yay, you're now a seagull. And the blackbird spends this entire time being like, this is very strange. And then a bluebird shows up and basically is like, look, you're a blackbird. And the blackbird for the first time feels like somebody actually saw the blackbird as a blackbird, which was like it was like, not because the blackbird had spent this entire time trying to fit in this space, because the blackbird felt more at home in the ocean. It had nothing to do with the other birds. It was like, this is where I want to be. And then, so the moral, of course, because I love a weird moral, is like this, like, the story is this, like, well, what it's important to see people, but it's also important to feel seen. Like you want people to see you for who you are. That had nothing to do with race. Turns out, when you have a dark-skinned Black person play that role in the show, it says something very specific about that story, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't think about it. It didn't occur to me until we were doing it. And then people were like, I thought that's why you cast this person. And it was like, oh, nope. And again, these are examples of me. Like, I'm like very pro consciousness, but I didn't know. I didn't think about it. I wasn't aware of that thing.
Yeah.
And again, that's not to say that body can't be Black, but you can now we're like, oh, that's interesting. And does it mean something if that's the only Black person in the show? If this is the only dark-skinned person, if there are multiple dark-skinned person, does it change the way that story hits? Does it make, and if that's the case, where else do you put a Black body? If you put it in this role, what does it say about that relationship? And that conversation is real, and that conversation is happening, and it happens every time we're going into casting. There is not a right way to do Newton's Cradle. It's just part of the nature of the thing.
Yeah. Fascinating. We are at an hour and 47 minutes.
I know. I was like, we have done. I'm just impressed if anybody actually sat and listened to us gab this entire time.
Incredible. I think, we can keep talking after we end this broadcast.
Yeah, for sure.
I have more things I want to talk about.
I have to get another White Claw. I'm out.
Oh, perfect. I can't go to Taco Time anymore, but I can find something else.
Okay.
Thank you, Heath, so much for joining us, and this is always fun, but it's also labor for you. So I appreciate you taking the time to give voice to both your essay and also just your general thoughts on the world and stuff. I appreciate it. Thanks everyone else for joining us.
Yeah. Thanks for sticking with us.
Any of you have been here for all hour and 48 minutes of this. I salute you. I applaud you.
Did anybody?
I don't know. Yeah. Comment if you've been here the whole time.
Comment below.
Because I appreciate you. Comment.
I want to call you out. I want to say congratulations congratulations, Jill Kling.
Oh, yeah. Jill Kling.
You made it.
Time.
Get it. That's
all right.
That's
Thank you so much for being here. Thanks, Heath. Stick around because I'm going to keep talking to you.
Yeah, for sure.
But thank you, everyone. We'll be back in a couple weeks, 2 weeks, and you'll find out soon who that guest shall be.
It's me again. I'm talking more about racism. Welcome to your new world.
all racism, all the time. Bye, everybody.
All right. Yeah, it's Brian Knoll.